Computer. Okay. Good morning, or good afternoon, actually. Welcome to Talking Smart Conversation with Educators and Philosophers from around the world. Today's guests are Professor Maughn Gregory and uh, professors, I should say, Maegan Laverty. I'm your host, Richard Mort Morehouse. Let me begin the introduction with Maegan Laverty. I did,
Laverty.
yes, thank you. I'll stumble. That's why I want to keep this thing so it keeps the okay.
We're all friends. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, that's right. Anyway, Megan is an associate professor of philosophy and education at Teachers College, Columbia. Before joining Teachers College in 2005, she was assistant professor at the Educational Foundations Department at Montclair State. She received her Master's of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Melbourne and her Ph.D. from the University of New South Wales. As a philosopher of education, Professor Laverty research interest is moral philosophy, a moral education with a focus on language, communication, and concept. She has published widely in these areas, and there's a number of articles coming out in forthcoming journals. Maughn Gregory is a professor of educational foundations at Montclair State, where he is director of the Institute for the Advancement of Philosophy for Children. He holds a BA, an MA, and a PhD in philosophy, as well as a JD. Yeah, he publishes and teaches in areas of philosophy of education, philosophy of children, pragmatism, gender studies, Socratic and contemplative pedagogies, and is editor and author of numerous articles. The complete bibliography or selected bibliography will be presented at the end of the broadcast, when it's published in a written form. Okay. With that out of the way, we can just start a little conversation. And I think we talked a little bit or wrote a little bit back and forth about what we might talk about. And one of the things that I've been interested in, just because of my own kind of formation in the late 60s and early 70s, is the connection between philosophy, social sciences and philosophy for children, and how those things inform each other, are at odds with each other, and kind of your general perspective on that kind of relationship. So whoever wants to start, jump in and we'll go from there. Uh, Mon?
Okay. Um, well, I think that education is one of the places where philosophy and social sciences really comes together and informs each other in important ways. I think so. Megan and I are both working in coming from philosophy and philosophy of education, um, but all the work we do in teaching and in research and in doing philosophy for children is also informed by the social sciences, in particular education research, research into different pedagogical strategies, for example, research into structural structures of education and government and societies that make certain kinds of education possible and make certain kinds more difficult to have. So I think, yeah, I think it's really it's a very fruitful relationship between these different disciplines.
Megan, you want to add something? And then I have a
Yeah, no, I think I would agree with everything Mon said.
Well, what got me interested, because when I first started teacher formation stuff, we were studying Ed Fenton in the new social studies. I don't know if that's a long time ago for you guys. It's yesterday for me, but and his work, Jerome Bruner's anthropology curriculum, all of those pieces, even later in that deschooling society, and all of those things were kind of right in the middle of my training in philosophy for children. And so I just think it's such a rich area. And I don't know, well, I mean, tell me more about how you're keeping up with not those areas in particular, but generally how you see those some of the specifics about how they relate to each other. I guess just because I have my own perspective on kind of how I did it. So, uh,
Well, you were one of the really important people in philosophy for children, Mort, especially in the earlier years, to bring that perspective to it. Because I think a lot of the people who were attracted to it in the beginning and started doing work from universities were philosophers in philosophy departments who may not have had much education or experience in educational studies and social sciences and educational research and curriculum development and educational psychology, all those kinds of things. I mean, fortunately, Matt Littman did have a
yes.
background in psychology, and he was quite well read in educational psychology. So he was able to have those conversations back and forth. But not a lot of other people were, and you were, I've always been one of them. That's one thing I've always appreciated about you.
I guess on reflection, it is one of the things I tried to bring to the conversation and to see where the connections were and how I think Ed Fenton's work particularly impressed me because there was a lot of reading of text, and then you read the text and you get involved in the text and really explored in kind of depth. And I think that was one of the reasons why I did well on my history GRE, because that's what I've been doing when I started teaching. So, but that's kind of a whole nother story. But that's kind of the roots of my interest, and I think we still need to keep that conversation alive, and even enhance it because. Um, I think there's a lot of new stuff too. I've been recently quite fascinated with Ryan and Daisy, and their work on what the heck is it called? Here I have it right here. The uh, self-determination theory, and of course Carol Gilligan's latest stuff on the human voice, all of those kind of pieces. And I think, you know, I just, I guess I keep wanting those things to be maybe not center, but certainly an important part of philosophy for children. So, yeah. Anywho, I didn't mean to pontificate there. I shouldn't be doing that. But
No, I was going to add, I think it has really helped that in the Department of Educational Foundations now at Montclair State University, there's Alina Resnitskaya. She has a faculty position there. She's a professor there. And she's been collaborating with Maughn and students in philosophy for children, engaging them in educational research with, a stress on argumentation and argumentation theory. But I think that has really sort of enhanced, I suppose, the commitment and the understanding of some of those features of the social sciences. I don't know if you'd agree more, but I think that's made a big difference.
Absolutely, yeah. And in our when we had our doctoral program, we had a lot of students coming to us from philosophy, but because it was a doctoral program in the College of Education, they had to take all these courses in quantitative and qualitative research, and got so fascinated by that many of them ended up doing empirical-based dissertations, and that was of tremendous value to us because there are questions about the work we do that can only be answered and approached through those kinds of methods and those disciplines. So to me, it's actually equally as important or as the philosophy.
yeah.
One instance of that Maegan and I have recently become interested in is looking into the theory, sort of an understated theory that Matt Littman and Ann Sharp developed when they were putting the curriculum together, the first IPC, K through high school philosophy curriculum, in which the story they tell is that they started with Harry Stottlemyre for 5th grade because that's when kids can start doing informal logic. And then after that, they can go into ethics and politics and the other things as going up into high school. But asking themselves, what would a preparatory curriculum look like to get kids ready to do that kind of logic by fifth grade? And so they came up with um, a theory of what kinds of like thinking moves and inquiry moves kids would need to be familiar with and practice before that, and then before that. So like in Pixie, you have working with analogies, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And then before that, I'm doing like making distinctions and making comparisons. But that was a theory that they came up with based on philosophy and based on logic and based on teaching critical thinking. And it needs to be that's the kind of thing that educational research does. I mean, those are the kinds of questions that educational, like, is that the right developmental sequence to go through?
Yes. And I think, I mean, that's an important question about a right or maybe a number of right developmental approaches. But I think that sort of embedded my sense is from Matt. He always had a sense that kids were capable of thinking more clearly and more articulately than any of Piaget's or anybody else's work, and that, and of course, from the work of, now I won't say his name, but the guy that wasn't
Gareth Matthews?
Matthews, yes,
Yeah.
yeah. I mean, he really had that sense, and the way of capturing that language of children is amazing. Yeah, well, and again, I think one of the things I picked up with that, and that is the challenges of listening and how to listen for philosophical thought when it comes out of the mouth of someone you don't expect to have philosophical thought, and how to recognize that and say, "Oh my God, this is really interesting thinking in it." And so, yeah, and again, I'm sorry I'm dominating here, but I think that's what I took to psychology as well, because it seems to me that those kinds of you have to find some of the core philosophical and psychological issues in whatever you teach and see how those things develop and can be nurtured. So I will try to be more conversational and less of a
Oh, no, no, this
lecture
is
here.
fascinating. Well, and one of the things that Matthews did was he wrote several essays he was doing philosophy of psychology.
Yes.
He was looking at psychological studies and talking about them philosophically. What assumptions were they making? And in one of the ways he did that more, you just mentioned, was that, like in some of Piaget's work, Matthews recognized that in some of the transcripts, some of the moves the young kids were making were philosophical, and their questions were philosophical. But because they were sort of recognized as nonsense or imaginary or not really, not serious. But bringing a philosopher's eye to it, he could see, no, there's some serious philosophical thinking going on here that's been overlooked.
Yeah. Well, and I think I've just discovered probably less than a year ago that Charles Taylor really began his work in psychology, and I mean his dissertation was kind of in defense of kind of some forms of psychological research, and yeah, it's let's see, yeah. It's called The Exploration of Behavior. Um,
Mm.
and that's his Oxford dissertation. Uh,
Wow.
so I'm just always fascinated by the way people pull those things together and how there are no set threads that people pull to pull those ideas together, because I mean I never thought about, even though some of his early works, some of his collected essays, you can think, well, of course that's kind of where he came from, but then when you see the dissertation you think, holy cow, that's it's a whole new world. So uh,
Was it recently published, Mort?
Yeah, it was republished by Routledge. Um,
Ah,
and so, but this, let me see, I have all the, this is 2021. Uh,
mm,
uh, and I think the dissertation was, let's see if I can, but I don't see it easily here on it, and I don't want to, oh, 1964. That's when he did his dissertation. So right at the sort of tail end of, and it was really a major challenge to Skinner. So uh,
Not
that's
many, not many 1964 dissertations would be worth republishing in 2021. But there are not many Charles Taylors around.
that's right. That's right. But so I was surprised when I heard when I read about that. I thought, well, let's see if he
Wow.
actually published it. And so anyway, and it's as you might expect, it's a challenging read, but that's Charles Taylor. So
yeah.
yeah.
I
Uh,
just thought of another way that social sciences are informing, helping philosophy for children, and I think philosophy of education more generally, and that is that uh, anthropological studies and cultural studies are helping us recognize cultural biases, cultural perspectives that have been taken as universal
yes,
in
yeah,
educational programming and in
yeah,
philosophy for children in particular. And that's really important.
yeah. Well, if I were a young man, I would start all over with trying to work harder at integrating psychology, philosophy, and anthropology in particular. Um, and my other than Matt Lipman, the person that schooled me the most uh, was Jerome Bruner. And
Mm,
he had that wonderful opportunity to be teaching in that, whatever it is, social sciences 100 or something, where they had this interdisciplinary group that, from anthropologists to, on up and down the whole hierarchy. And to me, that's such a rich understanding. And I think Bruner, I don't know how directly, but I think indirectly at least, Bruner had a significant influence on Lippmann. Uh, no. And if you think that's true, can you elaborate that on that a little bit? Because I have a back of my head understanding of that, but not very well articulated. Oh, who's going to start?
I'm talking too much. Megan, you talk. There's in our book that's going to coming out on Matt Lippman soon, there's a chapter in which they talk about Bruner. Is that Stefano's, right? Stefano's chapter from Italy.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah, but Megan, do you remember more about that?
Um, no, that's why I was hoping you'd answer that question. I do know that we talk a little bit about it in the introduction in terms of the spiral curriculum and just coming back again, just to your point earlier, Mort, when you said that Matthew Lippman really believed that kids could engage philosophically and engage in thinking moves. And so the curriculum is really designed to introduce them at in the most basic way, and then come back to them again in
Right.
slightly more advanced ways that are age appropriate. And I mean, there's evidence. I mean, Matt himself acknowledges the influence of Bruner on him and the creation of the curriculum. But Stefano's article, I think, goes into sort of even more depth than that in terms of the influence. And I just don't have it at my fingertips, on my mental fingertips.
Either.
Maybe Maughn does.
Oops. The
Oh,
only
you
other
mean?
thing I remember is that that famous line, Bruner's famous line, that any any discipline can be taught with integrity to children of any age. You do it the right way.
Exactly, exactly. Yes, yes. He says something in there about with intellectual honesty. If that's a part of, yes. I couldn't come up with the total quote either, but I was thinking about that. The Reggio schools, also often, so one of the things we talked about casually, probably 20 or so years ago, about how we could maybe do a NACI meeting in Reggio. Just because that would be just a wonderful opportunity to, and Bruner was on the board of education or whatever their for the Reggio Emilia School. So
Oh, I didn't know that either. I remember that conversation about Nacy doing that.
yeah,
We
yeah,
should
yeah.
still, we should think about that again.
Yeah, we really should. We really should because, I mean, what a interesting opportunity. And again, I think, see that's why I wanted to open with this topic because there's such a close connection between things like Reggio Emilia and philosophy for children in spirit. If in so we I think what we need to do is articulate the spirit of some of those things and then figure out how it fits into the actual curriculum. But the spirit of those kinds of places is very inspirational. So anyway,
I
that's
agree. And just for our listeners, NACI is the North American Association for Communities Inquiry.
thank you, thank you.
There's a lovely network of United States, Canada, and Mexico that has biannual conferences and publishes the journal that you edited for a number of years.
Yes, 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 yeah.
Many.
That, that was
We
such a
should plug the journal. It's Analytic Teaching and Philosophical Praxis.
yep, yes.
And it's open access. All the issues are free download available online from Viterbo University. So I'm giving you a plug.
Thank you, thank you. Well, I was kind of thinking about one of the next questions that I wanted to kind of look at was the 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 role, the status, the place and kind of intellectual and educational history that Lippmann and Sharp hold. And what reminded me that we needed to go back to that was there was an article, and I don't know the author because I read the article, and it is in this new issue of Analytic Teaching, but about Matt Lippmann in particular is placed within a kind of a sense of intellectual history rather than just being a founder of philosophy for children. And I'm misstating that the spirit of that article, but that's how I remember it anyway. And I thought that was refreshing to think about Matt Lippmann in particular in the light of larger picture of intellectual history. You know, it's sort of like, John Dewey. Well, John Dewey's not progressive education, and so how does John Dewey and Matt kind of fits that same position. He's not philosophy for children. He's a much richer scholar than that. And I think we have to learn how to recognize his contributions in a new light. Uh, So again, that's the setup. Now go for it.
Again, I'm going to let Maughn talk about this just because Maughn has been really researching sort of Matt's place within the history of pragmatism, principally, but also in relationship to the philosophy of Justice Buckler. So this is really something I think Maughn is much better placed to talk about just because he's been so immersed in doing this work.
Well, yeah, I would say, and I've recently been working on a paper on Matt's theory of judgment. That was one of his main things was judgment and education for judgment and what is judgment. And some of Matt's early writings, even before he was, or while he was just beginning in philosophy of children, he was writing on Buckler and Buckler's theory of judgment, and Matt was sort of uh, embellishing or taking it further and doing different things with it. And you can see how it feeds into the way he thought about philosophy for children and education for judgment. So I think Matt's, for me, his place in the history is largely around his theory of thinking and judgment, and what it means to have a theory of education for judgment, education for for a time he was calling it higher order thinking, and then later on he called it multidimensional thinking, but the different modes of thinking, creative thinking and caring thinking, which you wrote about so beautifully, Mort, in our book, Van Sharp, on the difference between Matt's and Anne's understanding of what caring thinking means. But in order to, like I'm saying, to have a view of education for that, you have to sort of have a view of what that is. And I think he doesn't get enough credit for that because it's very, very rich.
Yeah, well, I'll ask another question, and I don't know who's the expert on this, but I remember reading, and now I don't remember where, but in one of Matt's footnotes someplace, he talked about an article that he wrote for Merleau-Ponty, and he said it was lost in the attic someplace. Has anybody ever discovered that? Because he said he couldn't afford to get it translated into French, if I remember correctly. Is
That's
it?
correct. Yeah, that was it. He wrote that in his autobiography.
Yeah, yes,
He,
yes, okay. Yeah.
yeah. And as far as we know, that article hasn't been retrieved. Like whether it's in the archives somewhere still to be discovered or whether it's gone forever, I don't think we know yet for sure. Um, yeah, he may have even been left in France
Oh,
for
true.
all. No, I hope not. But um, yeah, it's about the extent of my knowledge of it. Do you know any more, Maughn?
No, just that like you said, he wrote it during his postdoctoral um, visiting scholar situation, Fulbright scholarship at the Sorbonne in France
Yeah.
in the mid 50s, and that's the trip he met his first wife on that trip on the boat going over.
Yeah.
We don't have that, and we also don't have his article to Hannah Arendt on the Little Rock
Oh,
controversy. We have her letter, her response, her letter to him saying, "Thank you so much for writing this. Here's where I agree and here's where I disagree." But we don't have the original essay he wrote to her.
yeah.
But maybe it'll surface, hopefully,
Yeah.
someday.
Well, I did the same thing. Nothing is grand, but when I finished my dissertation, I wrote a short article as a part of the body of work that you need to do in addition to your dissertation. And so I sent the article off to Ivan Illich, and I never heard from him for a year. And then I got this handwritten note that basically said, "Well, I've been in Germany for a year, but and I want to and I lost the letter, particularly because
Oh,
one of the things that and you move from office to office and things get lost. But one of the things I remember is that he said he thought it was a technically proficient view of three close friends. And I said, and it still haunts me, was that a compliment or not? Because technically proficient from Illich isn't necessarily a compliment.
Anybody else it would be, but
Well, yeah, yes, but no, no, knowing what I do of him. Oh, but I'm sorry, we're rambling, but this was the purpose of this to ramble. There is a lovely book called 50 Years After Deschooling, which I just finished reading a week or so ago, which is quite interesting in the way that it integrates the whole business of formation of Catholic priests and CDUC. And so, and did you ever go to CDUC or close by when you were in Mexico? Because I think it was still at least going to some degree. So
Mm.
you never made it there. I never did
No,
either.
it didn't, unfortunately.
Yeah.
But that's another area more schooling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's another big area where philosophy and social sciences come together and sometimes conflict, but oftentimes they're kind of saying the same things about problems with schooling, but in different ways.
Exactly. And that's a really challenging piece to get right about what deschooling means. It's sort of like defunding the police. Those are not necessarily the way people have interpreted. And deschooling certainly wasn't what people want to do with education these days. But I think the right wing has taken that in another direction. And so, and that's kind of sad because that's such a rich idea, I think. And, and well, that's a whole nother story, but to connect, there's a lot of things that I read in that book that I really want to know about. And one of the things was why Cardinal Spellman, who was pretty conservative, was such a um, bulwark against people discrimination against Illich. I mean, apparently Cardinal Spellman basically saved his career, and then when he died, that's when Illich went before the Inquisition, and so all of that interesting stuff was going on. So, and the book never dealt much with that little piece about what happened to Spellman in the Inquisition, passing note, and it made me want to do more work. That often happens. But anyway, uh, so anyway, go ahead.
We think more that, one of the debates today in philosophy for children is this question of whether philosophy for children fits within the school as
Oh,
it's currently envisaged, and sort of practiced, or whether it necessitates, just by virtue of the kind of thing that it is, a transformation of the school. And we think that's still a really live question for people in philosophy for children. Of course, it depends a lot on how you conceive of the school, and sort of you have to take into account there's great variation amongst schools. I mean, it's very difficult to talk about the school as if there were such a thing. But I think the question is still very pressing, to what extent is this about fitting in to what's already there, and to what extent is this about reforming what's there, or possibly having to reject what's there and locate itself elsewhere outside of the school.
and that, raises all kinds of questions about connectivity of those kinds of things. I mean, you think about the philosophical cafe kind of movement for a while, and is that some version of that a way of getting philosophy out of the school and into the world, or is that yeah, and what does it mean to be educated is really what's at core here, and uh, can there be, and then you go all the way back to what's his name with teaching as a subversive activity, and you think, well, how much,
Postman.
yeah, how subversive can you be and still maintain the structure of the school, and where is education in that mix, and so yeah, no, there's
Yeah, I mean there have been people who do philosophy with children, for children, maybe at the school but not as part of the school, like not it's not part of the education or the curriculum, but they get to go there and do it,
yeah,
and they don't really want to be part of the
yeah,
whole system, right? And they in fact maybe pride themselves on not being part of the whole system. And there are people, of course, like Matt and Ann, who thought we need to prepare teachers to be the ones doing the philosophy because that would reform other things that happen in the classroom and other, that would kind of reform schooling. It would be a step toward reforming schooling if the teachers were the philosophers in the room doing it with the kids. But there are a lot of critiques today about people who are seen to be using philosophy for children as a way of sort of propping up in an instrumental way schools that just feed capitalism, by teaching kids better thinking skills and getting them better grades on tests and making them more efficient cogs in the machine. So that's a critique that we hear a lot.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, yeah, and one of the real challenges, I guess, is there are not a lot of good forums to critique uh, education, capitalism, all of that stuff that gets mixed in, and and some going back to Illich, I mean, there was something, and if I'm understanding this correctly, when at least at one point during CDOC, Center for Intercultural Documentation, the deal was if you wanted to teach a class, it cost $25. If you wanted to take a course, it was $25, and we don't keep any records. So it was an opportunity then, and that's how Paul Goodman and all kinds of other people developed books, and Frary spent some time there, and all of those people developed ideas because they had this crucible for those heated ideas to both warm and cool, and I think and again I think that was part of, and I never was able to articulate that in my time with NACI, but I think that was part of what NACI was about in some ways. We wanted to provide a forum where there could be some deep discussions about all kinds of things that maybe didn't go anyplace, but were really germinating ideas. And I think that was the spirit of which that was generated. And in fact, why I wanted to call this Talking Smart. Because Talking Smart is the hallway conversation that you have with students. It's the guy you run into at the local bar, and that's where important talking smart happens. When you really kind of get down to the things that you really care about, and that don't fit in any standard conversational venues. So that's kind of what I hope this is about, and more people can use it as a place to generate ideas and think about things. So, but anyway,
We find that at the Mendham workshops when at like 9 or 10 o'clock at night when all the sessions are over, right? We gather and with or without a glass of wine and we talk for a couple hours.
yeah,
A
yeah,
lot of the really good stuff happens there for
yeah.
sure.
Yeah, my Mendham was at the Poconos back in what 1980, I think, summer of 1980. Yeah, and with what was her first name? Silver. I can't remember what her first name was.
Ruth. Was
Uh,
it Ruth
yes,
Silver?
Ruth Silver. Yeah, Ruth Silver was there, and Pritchard and Ron Reed and Judy Kyle, and that was kind of our group, and it was a yeah, and what's his name? I shared the honeymoon suite. We all stayed in the honeymoon suites in Pocono, and ours didn't have the heart-shaped bathtub, but we did have a heart-shaped cut out of the rug in front of the fireplace. So uh, Mort, no, I'm trying to think of his name. He was from Hunter College or one of the.
Mark. Was it Mark Weinstein?
No, no, Mark was no, no, Mark wasn't there. although Mark may have been there. Um, yeah, but
Other guy. Hmm.
I can't remember. But anyway, it doesn't matter. We had a grand time. It was a really, great experience. But anyway, so maybe we can just kind of take another look at another issue, which is we could talk about forever, I suppose, but about critical theory in philosophy for children and how they enhance each other and bump heads and whatever. And so I won't say anything more about that except to invite you to think about that. Uh,
Me? Well, I'll take the lead. I'm sure Mon will follow up. I think Maughn and I have been excited about um, the sort of the emergence of people interested in critical theory within philosophy for children. So I think both of us had an interest in critical theory within the context of teaching philosophy of education.
okay.
But then when the work of, I think, Darren Chetty specifically was appearing and being read, we got quite excited because I think we see tremendous potential in critical theory in a number of ways. And I can mention at least two and then maybe hand it over to Maughn. One of the things I think that critical theory offers philosophy for children is a way to think about, another way to think about what's going on in the community of philosophical inquiry. And so rather than just focusing on the thinking moves and the social moves, and which are very important, it also allows you to think about the ways in which structural racism and structural sexism and class are playing out in the community of philosophical inquiry. And once you sort of realize that and recognize that, you have to do something about it. You can't just be complacent. You can't just sit back. And that's, in keeping with the philosophy for children, that's something you involve the whole community in. But if you're going to involve the whole community in that, then you need to assume responsibility for an education in critical theory for those members of the community. So it involves thinking about how to bring that into the community of inquiry as something that students read and think about and talk about together. And so I think that's the other way in which critical theory contributes to philosophy for children, is that it can inform the writing of curriculum, and it can inform the choice of picture books, and it can inform the choice of curriculum materials, or the sequencing or the organizing of them. It can become itself a thematic interest. And, I think people are beginning to do that. I think Darren Chetty's work again on picture books was sort of very informative for beginning to think about curriculum in those terms. I think Steve Williams has written a story that Maughn's read that sort of introduces conversations about race and white ignorance and class. So I think that's tremendously exciting as well. And I think too, the commitment that's been demonstrated on the part of the larger community, having a special issue on it, coming out in childhood and philosophy, having Darren Chetty be one of the keynote plenary speakers at the most recent meeting of NACI or NACI. I think that's just wonderful to see, because I think this is work we need to do, and I think I think it's only going to enrich both our practice and the curriculum. And it raises other questions. And so one of the questions that was raised at the conference recently is one of the purposes of philosophy to raise children to be social activists, because that's a perception of what you're doing when you introduce critical theory into both the, the community, the pedagogy, and the curriculum. And I think, what's at issue here partly is your perception of philosophy and what philosophy is, as well as your perception of philosophy for children. For some people, philosophy for children is about the teaching of critical thinking, understood in the traditional sense of critical thinking, which is just a set of skills that you can then utilize to think better about any topic and to have the values that you have about those topics. But I think critical thinking in a more contemporary vein includes this attention to structural injustices. So that's a little bit from me. I'll let Maughn follow up.
That was fantastic, Maegan. Yeah, I love that. Yeah, that was a perfect summary, I think. I just add a couple details. I think the first major encounter with critical theory that philosophy for children had was in the 90s when feminism became a big thing in philosophy for children. And Anne Sharp guest edited 2 special issues of the Thinking Journal on feminism and philosophy for children. And some of those articles were really hard hitting, about how the sexism that typically happens in a community of inquiry discussion in schools that often goes uncommented and unnoticed. And also some of the gender stereotypes in some of the Littman novels and in the picture books that Gareth Matthews reviewed. So that was, and I think that was, it needed to happen, and it's still ongoing. And then Darren raising the issue of race in many of the same ways is tremendously important. And I think just to build on the comment on philosophy, I think one of the
just before you start, we didn't mention Leonard Harris.
Yes. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So I'll just in fact, what I was going to say kind of brings in Leonard Harris. So the development of what's now called critical pragmatism has been really important in the last several years. There was like the first anthology on critical pragmatism about, now I think it's like 15 years ago. But in that book Cornel West says, and Mort, you've written about Cornel West. Mm-hmm. He says if an alien came down and looked at and read Dewey and Peirce and James and all the the mainstream, you would never know that the civil rights movement happened. You would never know that racism or slavery even or Jim Crow had been a thing in American philosophy, because and it's not just, of course, not just pragmatism, and it's not just American philosophy that has basically ignored these issues over the centuries, right? It's basically Western philosophy has. So anyway, one of the Leonard Harris credits Elaine Locke with being the first critical pragmatist. And Leonard Harris, when he was at Morgan State University, came to Mendham, studied with Matt and Ann, and then did a philosophy for children program in Washington, D.C., predominantly Black students, populations, and teachers, and then wrote a book about it called Children in Chaos. And Matt Libman has an essay in the beginning in which he basically says underprivileged children in chaos need philosophy worse than anyone. But it's basically because they need, the intellectual skills to cope with their lives. And Leonard Harris comes along and says, yes, but the program also, philosophy also needs to invite children to actually philosophize about those conditions. And like Maegan says, start to recognize the structures. It's not just that there are certain bad people doing racist things. There are racist structures that account for what's going on around them. And philosophy needs to give them the tools to do that. Maegan and I and Darren interviewed Leonard Harris about his experience. We have our interview up on our line. If people want to watch it. It's a great interview. And I just finished reading an anthology of Leonard Harris's work, which I also recommend. So yeah, I think Maegan and I have just finished a chapter for a book that's coming out from the Dewey Center on Dewey, in which we're saying that philosophy for children basically has the potential of being an ideal civics education in that it stays deliberative, but is also at the same time it can take the critical turn and start to face these issues more directly. I think I'll just say one last thing. In my estimation, Maegan and I have also been looking at the Mort curriculum, which is the philosophy for children curriculum for high school that deals with political philosophy. And there are a few issues of sexism, race in the novel, really nothing about race, but in the manual raises all kinds of issues, social issues about immigration and race and class. And in the introduction to that manual, Matt and Nan say something really interesting. They say, basically, once you start talking about politics and once you start philosophizing about politics, these issues are bound to come up. So we've given you resources to deal with them in the manual, but we're not going to address them directly in the novel, which is really interesting.
Yes, yes.
So I think the assumption has kind of been, if you give children the opportunity to think well and think with each other and to philosophize, and these issues are going to inevitably come out. Like basically that will kind of take care of itself. If you take care of the philosophy, the social issues will take care of themselves. And we think later on, Anne didn't think that was quite right, and she started to write curricular novels that more directly addressed some of these social issues. And we think that's what needs to happen.
Yeah. Well, I think this is a wonderful place to end. Why? Because it should be the beginning. Should be the beginning of all kinds of interesting conversations. And if the three of us have done in a little bit of our work, we will invite other people to participate and see what they can develop on their own. So thank you. I'm going to end this now. Stop. Okay.
Thanks.